Better? Okay. Welcome to the house of God. It's a privilege to be here. It's a privilege to share His Word. And I would like to share something with you this morning that has opened my eyes and been a real blessing in my life and helped me to love God more. And if we love God more, what does the Bible teach us? Love is the fulfilling of the... Yeah? So if you see God for who He is, then you can love Him. And if you love Him, then that determines how good your life, your outward life is going to be. Talking about good outward lives, I'd like you to turn your Bibles with me to Job chapter 1. We're going to be spending a lot of time in this book this morning, so don't lose your place. Job chapter 1. Now, who was Job? We all know this story very well, right? How rich was Job? Job had a lot of possessions. As a matter of fact, he had 7,000 sheep, in verse 3, and 3,000 camels. He must have done a lot of travelling. That's like 3,000 cars in our terms today. Job had 3,000 cars and he had 7,000 sheep and 500 yoke of oxen. He must have ploughed a lot of ground. And that's 1,000 cows. And he had 100 she-asses and a very great household. It seems that Job must have been in the transport industry quite a lot, because he had 3,000 camels and 500 she-asses. Now, camels and she-asses are beasts of burden. They're things you use to carry things from one place to another. An ass might be a little like having a ute, and a camel might be a little like having a big ute or a small truck, right, in their terms in those days. Now, if you've got that many animals, I just want you to think, you've got 14 children. Could that family look after that many animals? How many servants do you think you'd need to look after that many animals? And they didn't tend to have fences in those days either. They'd need a lot of servants. As a matter of fact, the Bible says in the end of verse 3 that this man was the greatest of all the men of the East. Now, not only was Job a very rich man, but if we turn our attention to Job chapter 29, Job wasn't just rich and selfish. He was rich and very good-hearted. Job chapter 29, and let's start at verse 16. Actually, we'll go back a little bit. Let's just start right near the beginning. In verse 7, Job's talking about the way things were before all the calamities happened, and he says, "When I was out to the gate through the city, when I prepared my seat in the street, the young men saw me and hid themselves. The aged men arose and stood up. The princes refrained talking and laid their hand on their mouth. The nobles held their peace, and their tongue cleaved to the roof of their mouth." This is the sort of respect Job had. "When the ear heard me, then it blessed me. When the eye saw me, it gave witness to me." Why? Why was he so revered among his people? Let's have a look. "Because I delivered the poor that cried, and the fatherless, and him that had none to help him. The blessing of him that was ready to perish came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. I put on righteousness, and it clothed me. My judgment was a robe and a diadem. I was eyes to the blind, feet was I to the lame. I was a father to the poor, and the cause which I knew not I searched out. Job didn't wait for people who needed help to bump into him accidentally. He went looking for them. And so this man Job, he was a very good man. As a matter of fact, God's witness of his life comes out a little bit further on if we go back to the beginning. You remember the story. There's a meeting in heaven, and representatives are gathered from all across the galaxies to this big meeting. And the devil shows up. And God says, "What are you doing here?" And the devil says, "Well, I've been down on the earth, walking to and fro. It's my place, in other words. It's my kingdom, and I'm come here to represent it." And God's like, Have you thought about my servant Job? Have you considered him? If it's really your territory, in other words, why is there a man in your territory who loves me and serves me perfectly? Let's look at verse 8, chapter 1, verse 8. And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, that a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, Doth he fear God for naught? Hast thou not made an hedge about him and about his house and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But if you put forward your finger and you touch what he has. And the devil's saying, Job serves you out of selfishness. He serves you to get. He serves you because you look after him. Stop looking after him, we'll see a different Job. We'll see if he really is your servant or not. You know, sometimes the devil can bring this thinking in among Christians. We think, well, come to Jesus, you'll get saved. You'll escape punishment and death, and you'll get a mansion and a harp and a crown in the sky. And Christianity becomes all about blessing and receiving. Christianity becomes getting saved from death and a ticket to heaven. And instead of Christianity being about dying, Christianity is not about escaping death. Christianity is about dying. You've got to die to everything you have been and receive his life. When God created man in the beginning, what did he say? Let us make man in our image. That was his purpose in creating man, to look like him. And the purpose of redemption is the same. We are redeemed to get back what was lost. We are redeemed so that we can, like the Bible says, he who wants to save his life will lose it. We are redeemed to shine to the world. That's why when Jesus was about to leave this world, he said, I want my servants to be just like me, just like I'm like you, Father. They may be one in us, that we'll all be one, and there'll be unity. But we need to remember that when things go wrong in our lives, it's not a sign that God is not with us. It's not a sign that it's not okay in our lives and there's something wrong. We need to remember that we don't get our identity, we don't get our stability from how our day is going. It doesn't matter if it's a good day or a bad day. It's always a good day when God's in charge. It's always a good day when God's in your heart. Even when things go wrong, you are called to shine His light and His character in the face of your day, not because of it. When Jesus suffered on a cross, that's the time when the character of God shined the brightest. In contrast to the darkness, the unfairness, the injustice, the cruelty and the suffering. Christianity is not where we have this big Father Christmas in the sky. Christianity is to be like Him, to wake up in the morning and look like Him. That's what we are called to, and that's what it means to be saved. But let's get back to the story of Job here. What does the devil say next? What does God say to the devil? Okay then, go ahead. Just don't touch him. You can take away everything he has. You can do whatever you want. And the devil says, yes, this is great. I've got a free ticket to do what I want to do. So he goes down to earth. And he creates a whole lot of situations that destroy all of Job's property. Let's see how it happened in verse 13. There was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking in their eldest brother's house. And a messenger comes to Job. The oxen were ploughing, the asses were feeding. The Sabaeans came, fell on them, and took them all away, and I'm the only one that escaped. And while he was yet speaking, another one comes running up, panting, and saying, the fire of God has fallen from heaven and have burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I only escaped to tell thee. While he was yet speaking, another one runs up. The Chaldeans came. They took the camels. They've killed the servants, and I'm the only one. And while he was yet speaking, there came another and said, your sons and your daughters. You can imagine Job's feelings as he hears those words. He's just heard about the camels. He's just heard about the animals. Now, your sons and your daughters were in the house, and a big wind came and smote the four corners of the house. It fell on the young men, and they are dead. I'm the only one escaped. So Job gets up and he rends his clothes and shaves his head and falls down upon the ground and worships. Not what most people do. And he said, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Hang on a minute. Who took away? Who really took away? The curtain was just drawn back before. Who took away the stuff? The devil. Interesting. So, Job has lost everything he holds dear, everything he owns, and in all these things, it says in the last verse of the chapter, Job didn't sin and he didn't charge God foolishly. So, if we look at chapter 2, the devil comes back and God says, have you thought about my servant Job? And the devil says, yeah. You can take everything a man has, but unless you actually touch him. But you see, if I touch him, he will curse you to your face. And God says, okay. You can touch him, but don't touch his life. You can do anything to him, but don't kill him. Just think about this. Imagine if God wasn't holding the devil back in your life. Devil's pretty nasty. Imagine if the protection of God was not in your life. See what he did? I mean, like a fire from heaven that just destroys thousands of animals, inspires wicked people to come and destroy all. Big winds just come out of the wilderness and wipe out your house. Devil's capable of that, but he can't do it because God says he can't. One day that protection's going to be taken away. And we're going to see for a brief period in time what would happen if God wasn't protecting. Except he'll still protect his people. So, what happens next? Chapter 2. Job gets smitten with boils. I don't want to go into too much detail here because I know you know this story and I don't want to make it boring. He's smitten with boils from his head to his toe, and he sits there. He can't stand up, he can't sit down, he can't do anything without pain. And he sits there and scrapes himself with a piece of broken pottery to try and get rid of the pus that's coming out of all his boils. And Job's wife, she mustn't have been in a very good relationship with God because the devil managed to get to her too. And if we look at verse 9, his wife says to him, "Dost thou still retain thine integrity? Curse God and die." The one person who is closest to you in your life, you've just lost everyone and everything except her. And she says that to you. Just put yourself in his shoes. This is full on. This is really full on. And then come Job's friends. And the old saying, if you have friends like that, who needs enemies, was never truer than with Job's so-called friends. Let's look at verse 10 of chapter 2. I just want you to note something here. But he said unto her, "Thou speakest as one of the foolish women speaketh. What? Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this did not Job sin with his lips? Tell me, of whose hand did the evil come? From the devil. Who did Job think it came from? From God. You see, it is possible to be sincere, honest, converted even, and still have a few wrong ideas and not know God perfectly well. And Job, though he lived a perfect life and very blessed by God, and God had been living out through him, still had something to learn about God. It is possible to be the best example of a Christian there is and still not know God perfectly well. I want you to turn back with me to chapter 1, verses 4 and 5. Because we've always been accustomed to accept the statement in the Bible that Job was a perfect and upright man. And if we believe that, that's true, but if we don't get what the rest of the books of Job is saying, we will lose the whole point of the book and we'll lose the lesson. Let's look at Job chapter 1, verses 4 and 5. His sons went and feasted in their houses, every one his day, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And it was so, when the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning, and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, it may be, that my sons have sinned, and cursed God in their hearts. Thus did Job continually. Job seemed to have a real fear about cursing God. This is why the devil's trying to get him to do it. But interesting, isn't it? Did Job sacrifice for his sons and daughters because they sinned? Because maybe they might have. And this did Job how much? Continually. We're starting to see something here. Just maybe there might be a little bit of fear. There might be a little bit of almost paranoia in Job's life in this instance. Because it doesn't say they sinned, it said they got together. Where was Job? Why wasn't he with his family? Question, I'm not saying outright here that this is bad, but this arouses a little question in our minds. And later on in the story, if we look at Job chapter 3, we find Job, he starts to curse the day he was born. He said, let it be in darkness. Why did God let me be born? Let the shadow of death stain it. Let the darkness, and he just goes on and on. Let it be a solitary place, and the stars of twilight be dark. And because that day didn't shut up my mother's womb, and so sorrow wasn't hid from me. Why didn't I die from the womb? Verse 11. Why did I not give up the ghost when I came out of the belly? Then should have I lain still and been quiet. I should have slept. I should have been at rest. Well, Job isn't handling the situation too well, as can be expected, I guess. But interesting. If we look at verse 25 and 26. For the thing which I greatly feared is come upon me, and that which I was afraid of is come upon me. I was not in safety, neither had I rest, neither was I quiet, yet trouble came. Job had a lot of wonderful experience with God, but there was something that needed to change. Job was afraid. He was afraid that bad things would happen to him. And what did we read in the key text? In 1 John chapter 4 verse 18. 1 John chapter 4 verse 18. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casteth out fear, because fear hath torment. He that feareth is not made perfect in love. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time about the friends. But the friends, if we want to summarise what they said, it was, where there's smoke, there's fire, Job. Confess what you've done. God does not bring judgments like this down on someone who's righteous. Come on, confess. Don't hide it. There's got to be something. And they went on and on and on and on and on about it. And I want us to just look through a little bit of what Job had to say, because we're going to get an incredible lesson out of all of this by the time we finish. We're going to learn something amazing. Something that's going to open our eyes and possibly change our lives. Let's look at Job chapter 9, verse 16. Let's go to Job chapter 9 and verse 16. This is Job talking about God. If I had called, and he had answered me, yet would I not believe that he had hearkened unto my voice. For he breaketh me with a tempest, and multiplieth my wounds without cause. Verse 18, he will not suffer me to take my breath, but filleth me with bitterness. Verse 22, this is one thing, therefore I said it, he destroyeth the perfect and the wicked. If the scourge slay suddenly, he will laugh at the trial of the innocent. This is what Job is saying about God. There's a very prevalent theme in the thinking of the Old Testament Christians. Well, they were Old Testament Jews. And that is, whenever calamities come, it must be a punishment. And God must have done it because of something you did wrong. The Jews had the same. And they had the book of Job. They should have learnt about this. But who sinned? This man or his father that he's sick? And Jesus is like, neither. But it's very common thinking in the Old Testament. And Job is basically saying, God will laugh at the death of the wicked, and there's no judgment. He multiplies my wounds, but who was doing it? In the beginning, the book of Job draws back a curtain on the events in life and in the history of mankind. Who was doing the bad stuff? Was it God? Or was it the devil? Who took away all God's stuff? Who gave him those wounds? Who touched his flesh and gave him boils? Was it God? Or was it the devil? Let's look at verse 28. Actually, verse 30. Chapter 9, verse 30. If I wash myself with snow water and make my hands ever so clean, yet shalt thou plunge me in the ditch, and mine own clothes shall abhor me. Verse 33. Neither is there any daysman betwixt us, that he might lay his hand upon us both. Nobody between you and God? We're starting to see something here in Job's thinking, his belief system, that isn't true. What he's saying about God is not true. Just a couple more things before we go on to some more lessons about this. Let's look at chapter 16, verse 11. Job chapter 16 and verse 11. No, that is the right verse. God hath delivered me to the ungodly, and turned me over into the hands of the wicked. I was at ease, but he hath broken me asunder. He hath also taken me by my neck, and shaken me to pieces, and set me for his mark. His archers compass me about. He cleaveth my reins asunder, and doth not spare. He poureth out my gall upon the ground. Job's basically said, God destroys the righteous. There is no mediator. God caused all the bad things in my life to happen. What about your life? Have there been times in your life when things went wrong, when loved ones died, when jobs were lost, and you said, oh well, it must have been God's will? Is it really God's will that people suffer and die? Is that what He wants? Does God laugh at them like Job said? Does God ordain these things? I tell you what God's wish is for mankind. If He could do it right now, He would. He would take every human being straight to heaven with Him right now. But He can't. Because people have to see for themselves and choose for themselves. But God allows bad things to happen because under the circumstances of a messed up earth, it's the best way that is available and it's the best that He can do. And He, when loved ones die, He cringes and turns away and cries just like us. We don't have a high priest who can't be touched with the feelings of our infirmities. God cries when people die. And He sits with the mourners and He says, I wish I could have done something. I hate it. I wish I could have done something to change this. But trust me, in the end I'm going to take the devil's whip and I'm going to whip his behind so bad with it all the way to hell. And I'm going to take the things that he was using to destroy and I'm going to make them things to build up. And I'm going to use those things to save people in the kingdom. Don't you worry, the devil only thinks he's in charge. He only thinks he's winning. But I will win in the end. And I will find the best available path for you. Mightn't seem like it at the time. But I'll let things pan out. I'll protect you when you need protection. I will stop things from happening. I'll allow things to happen. And I'll make the devil's plan work against him, and he'll actually be building up my kingdom, if you'll just trust me. Job had 3 friends, and 3 men talked for a long time. And then 3 men were silent because they found Job to be just in his own eyes. And then a 4th man started to talk. We don't know when he showed up on the conversation, but there was a fourth man. If we look at Job chapter 32, we learn a bit about the fourth man in the conversation. The three men stopped answering Job because he was righteous in his own eyes, in verse 1. And then was kindled the wrath of Elihu. And Elihu goes on to say, well, I was quiet because you were older, but there's a spirit in man, and the Spirit of God, I believe, is in me. And now I'm going to stand in God's defence because you're all wrong. It was not right of you, Job, to say all those bad things about God. And it wasn't right of you to beat him up while he was suffering. I'm going to stand in God's defence. Let's look at verse 5. Elihu saw... Hang on. Maybe it's 33. I think I misplaced that verse. Let's not worry about it. Chapter 34... Verse 9. No, I'm sorry. I do have the wrong chapter here. Okay. Verse 9, for he hath said, it profiteth a man nothing that he should delight himself in God. Job has said this. Therefore hearken unto me, ye men of understanding, for far be it from God that he should do wickedness, and from the Almighty that he should commit iniquity. For the work of man shall he render unto him. Chapter 36 and verse 1. And Elihu also proceeded and said, suffer me a little, and I will show thee that I have yet to speak in God's behalf. I will fetch my knowledge from afar, and will ascribe righteousness to my Maker. Elihu is standing up for God here and saying, look, it's far from God to do wickedness. I need to stand up on God's behalf here, because a lot of bad things have been said about God in this conversation. I want you to look at chapter 37 and verse 23. Chapter 37, verse 23. Touching the Almighty, we cannot find him out. He is excellent in power and in judgment, and in plenty of justice. He will not afflict. We don't necessarily understand why this happened to you, Job. We don't understand God. But God's not like that. You're not right what you're saying about God. God doesn't do these things. We don't know why it's happened, but it doesn't happen because God did it. And it doesn't happen because God's unrighteous. Now, a fifth person joins the conversation. Any guesses who that is? God himself joins the conversation. Except he doesn't say a lot. He asks a whole lot of questions. He says, Job, if you really think you know everything, where does the ice come from? Where do the seasons come from? Why does all these things happen? If you really think you know as well as me, that you can say those sort of things, tell me. Aren't there a lot of things in this life that you don't understand? And maybe this is one of them too. Chapter 42. Job responds to God and he says, I know, verse 2, I know that thou canst do everything, and no thought can be withholden from thee. Who is he that hideth counsel without knowledge? Therefore have I uttered that I understood, and escheweth evil. That means you get as far away from it as you can, and you don't have anything to do with it. And now Job is saying, I repent in dust and ashes. Because now I understand. You see, it wasn't untrue that Job was a perfect man. But it is possible to be a perfect man and still need to know more about God. It's possible to be a perfect man and still not know Him so well. And God needs to change some things in a person's thinking. You know, if you believe that God did all those things, it becomes hard to love that God. And you're in danger of saying things that are not true. You're in danger when you have wrong ideas, even if your life is correct, even if your heart is right. And some of us Christians can be in danger, just like Job was, of believing wrong things. Sometimes this sort of thinking can slip into our experience. Sometimes we can think that once upon a time God was really mad. He was so mad that He wanted to kill you. And then Jesus jumped in the way and got killed instead. And that's the only reason you're alive. And we make the cross that's supposed to be the biggest evidence of God's love, and we put right in the centre of our thinking something that's so inaccurate. What about God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son? Not God was so mad at the world that He killed His Son. Sometimes in our Christian thinking, even though when we say it outright like that, we'd never believe it, but somewhere in the back of our mind we can have these thoughts. We can have these concepts about God. And it's very hard to love a God like that. What if God was there? And this is not a what if, but what if God was there suffering with His Son in the darkness? What if God loved His Son even more because His Son gave His life for us? What if sin is the villain and God is the one trying to do the saving? What if God isn't the one who kills us? What if God is the one who saves us? In the book of Genesis, when Cain sinned, God left him alive. What was the result? The flood. Because the wickedness grew and grew and grew and grew and grew until it was so out of hand that men thought evil continually. There was violence throughout the land and people wished they were dead. But God had to let Cain live because people would not have understood. They would have thought God was unjust if He killed him. So God had to let him live so people could see for themselves what happens if you let evil go on and on. But after that time, God sometimes put an end to nations when they went too far. Why? Because what sin would have done to them would have been much worse. When you punish your children, you don't punish them because you want to hurt them. You punish them because you want to save them from worse things, right? If God ever reaches out His hand It is to prevent something much worse from happening. Now, the book of Job was given to us for a reason. Job didn't suffer for nothing. Job suffered so all the martyrs could understand who was at fault and give the devil some credit for the things that were going on in this earth instead of saying it was all God's fault. Job suffered so the universe could see that it wasn't God who destroys men, and that the devil's efforts against man, if man submits himself to God, will only result in his good. And God gave you this story for you, so that you would understand in your life and stop blaming God for the bad things that happen to you. He draws back the curtain on your life. He draws back the curtain on history and helps you to understand that it is not God's fault and it is not God's doing that your loved ones die, that bad things happen in your life. It's God's permission. And here's God's promise to you. It's one of my favourite quotes. It's found in the book of Desire of Ages. Not without purpose does God send trial to his children. He never leads them otherwise than they themselves would choose to be led, if they could see the end from the beginning and discern the glory of the purpose which they are fulfilling as workers together with him. He subjects them to discipline to humble them, to lead them through trial and affliction, to see their weakness and draw near to him. God will never let anything happen to you that you wouldn't choose yourself if you stood at the end of the time and looked back and knew all the facts like he does. God has the benefit of hindsight, except he has hindsight when he looks into the future, because the past and the present are both the same. There is nothing, if you submit your life to God and put your life in his care, there is nothing that can touch you. You can sleep in peace in the middle of a sinking boat in a storm because you know that nothing can touch you. You can be at peace even when your whole nation rejects you, because you know nothing can come to you except that which was ordained. You can rest without fear of the future, because you know there is a God who's promised that this is what you want, or what you would want if you knew what he knows. And he'll never do something that he wants, he'll do what you want. And Job got to live the rest of his life without fear, without apprehension, without worrying about his kids constantly, but committing them into the hands of God. And he had more belongings than he ever had before, and more children. Job got to know God better through this experience. And he said, I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eyes see you. And we can live our lives without fear if we commit them into the hands of a God who knows best. It doesn't matter what comes. We can still sing because our day is going well and there's a better day coming. God has never been angry at you. He's been angry at what you did sometimes, and He's been angry at what you let dwell in here sometimes. But He's never been angry at you. God has never done anything bad to you. God has never taken away your loved ones. God has never